The day I decided to end my marriage was the day I uncovered the one secret that made me question everything I thought I knew about the man I loved. Emily Brooks tightened her grip around the thick envelope as she stood on the wide marble steps of the county courthouse in downtown Chicago. The crisp autumn wind brushed loose strands of blonde hair across her face while people hurried past, each carrying burdens invisible to everyone else. She looked down at the divorce papers one last time. Her signature rested neatly at the bottom of every page, steady and confident, even though her heart felt anything but steady. 3 years earlier she had walked down another aisle wearing a white dress and believing forever sounded simple. Now forever fit inside a plain manila envelope that weighed no more than a few ounces but somehow felt heavier than anything she had ever carried. She inhaled slowly before pushing open the courthouse door. Inside, fluorescent lights reflected against polished floors as quiet conversations echoed through the hallway. Families, attorneys, and strangers crossed paths without ever looking at one another. Emily waited patiently outside the clerk's office until her number appeared on the electronic screen. The woman behind the counter accepted the documents with a professional smile and stamped each page with practiced precision. The sound of the stamp echoed louder than Emily expected. It sounded final, permanent. She whispered a quiet thank you before turning toward the exit, telling herself not to look back. She had spent nearly a year convincing herself this was the only choice left. Ethan Brooks, her husband, had become a man she barely recognized. The charming entrepreneur who once surprised her with handwritten notes and late-night drives along Lake Michigan had disappeared behind endless meetings, business calls, and quiet dinners where silence replaced conversation. Every anniversary became another canceled reservation. Every promise seemed postponed until someday. Emily had stopped asking when someday would arrive. The elevator doors opened beside her, and Ethan stepped inside wearing the same navy suit he seemed to live in lately. His expression remained calm, almost unreadable, yet the faint shadows beneath his blue eyes hinted at countless sleepless nights. Their eyes met for only a second before both looked away. Neither smiled, neither spoke. The silence between them felt older than their marriage itself. Ethan glanced briefly toward the envelope in her hands. He understood immediately. Instead of anger, pleading, or surprise, he simply nodded once, as though he had been expecting this moment for a long time. That quiet acceptance hurt Emily far more than any argument ever could. She wanted him to stop her. She wanted him to ask her to stay. She wanted one reason to believe they still had something worth saving. Instead, Ethan reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and removed a small sealed envelope. He looked at it for several seconds before handing it to a middle-aged attorney standing nearby. "Make sure this stays confidential," Ethan said softly. "She must never see it." The attorney accepted the envelope with a reluctant nod, but as Ethan turned toward another hallway, the attorney's phone suddenly rang. Distracted, he placed both envelopes on the reception counter while answering the call. Emily stepped forward to collect her copy of the filed paperwork at the exact same moment. Without realizing it, she picked up the wrong sealed envelope. She thanked the receptionist and walked outside into the cool afternoon sunlight, completely unaware that she now carried the one secret Ethan had spent years protecting from her. A secret capable of destroying every painful assumption that had led her to file for divorce. Emily did not notice that the envelope in her handbag was heavier than the divorce paperwork she expected to carry home. Her thoughts were far too occupied by the strange calm on Ethan's face. She had prepared herself for anger, disappointment, perhaps even one final argument. Instead, he had simply accepted her decision as though he had already mourned the end of their marriage long before she walked into the courthouse. That quiet surrender lingered in her mind during the entire drive back to the condominium they had once chosen together. Chicago's afternoon traffic crawled along Lakeshore Drive while gray clouds slowly gathered over the skyline. The city looked exactly as it had every other weekday, yet everything felt different. Emily unlocked the front door and stepped into a home that suddenly seemed unfamiliar. The framed wedding photograph above the fireplace still showed two people smiling without hesitation. Ethan's favorite coffee mug rested beside the kitchen sink. His neatly folded jacket from the previous evening still hung over the dining chair. Every ordinary object reminded her that endings rarely happened all at once. They arrived quietly through hundreds of small moments that no one noticed until it was too late. She placed the envelope on the kitchen counter and wandered through the apartment almost automatically. Their bedroom remained perfectly organized. Ethan's side of the closet looked untouched except for the navy suit he had worn that morning. She ran her fingers across one of his neatly pressed shirts before quickly pulling her hand away. She refused to let herself become sentimental. She reminded herself why she had filed for divorce. For nearly 2 years, Ethan had missed birthdays, canceled vacations, ignored anniversary dinners, and answered business calls even during quiet evenings at home. Every time she asked whether something was wrong, he offered the same gentle smile and the same frustrating answer. Everything is fine. I just need a little more time. Eventually those words stopped sounding hopeful and started feeling like a wall between them. Emily remembered the countless nights she had fallen asleep alone while the light under Ethan's office door remained visible until dawn. She had knocked more than once, asking if he wanted coffee or simply someone to talk to. He always thanked her kindly, promised he would come to bed soon, and stayed behind that closed door for hours. Never once did he raise his voice. Never once did he blame her. Looking back, that almost hurt more than if they had argued. Silence slowly replaced conversation until both of them learned to live around each other instead of with each other. She opened the refrigerator, realizing she had skipped lunch, but closed it again without taking anything. Her appetite had disappeared weeks ago. Instead, she poured herself a glass of water and noticed the sealed envelope still lying where she had left it. Curious, she picked it up. The paper felt expensive, thicker than ordinary office stationery. There was no mailing address. Only one sentence had been handwritten across the front in dark blue ink. Personal. Confidential. For Ethan Brooks only. Emily frowned. She did not remember receiving anything like that from the courthouse. A faint feeling of uneasiness settled in her chest. She turned the envelope over slowly. The seal remained unbroken. She hesitated for several long seconds, telling herself she should simply return it. But another thought quietly surfaced. If this truly belonged to Ethan, why had he looked so determined to keep it hidden? Why had he specifically said that she must never see it? The questions grew louder than her conscience. Her fingertips rested against the edge of the seal as the afternoon sunlight faded across the kitchen floor. She closed her eyes for one brief moment before taking a slow breath, unaware that opening this single envelope would begin unraveling every painful belief she had carried about her husband and the marriage she had already decided was beyond saving. Emily carefully slipped a butter knife beneath the edge of the envelope, telling herself she was only trying to discover why Ethan had guarded it so fiercely. The seal lifted without tearing. Inside rested a thick stack of neatly organized documents, each separated by small colored tabs. The first page was not a financial report or a business contract as she expected. It was a handwritten letter. Her heartbeat slowed as she recognized Ethan's unmistakable handwriting. Emily, if you are reading this, then something happened that I hoped would never happen. It means the truth found you before I was ready to explain it myself. She stopped breathing for a moment. The words did not sound defensive. They did not accuse her of mistrust or regret. They carried only quiet sadness. She continued reading. I promised someone that I would protect your happiness, even if protecting it meant allowing you to misunderstand me. Some promises cost more than money. Some cost time. Some cost love. Emily lowered the page onto the kitchen counter and stared silently through the living room window. The city lights were beginning to appear one by one across the skyline. None of this matched the husband she believed she had known during the past 2 years. Ethan had never written dramatic letters. He preferred actions over speeches. Yet every sentence felt sincere, almost painfully honest. She reached for the next document. It contained legal records showing several properties transferred into a private trust. Her eyes widened when she saw her own name listed as the sole future beneficiary. The signature at the bottom belonged to Ethan, dated nearly 18 months earlier. Another folder contained insurance policies, retirement accounts, and investment statements. Again and again her name appeared as the protected beneficiary. She frowned. Ethan had never mentioned any of this. He had quietly secured her financial future while their marriage appeared to be falling apart. The next document surprised her even more. It showed that Ethan had refinanced several valuable personal assets, including the vacation cabin in northern Wisconsin that had belonged to his late grandparents. Emily remembered how much that place meant to him. They had spent their first wedding anniversary there, watching the sunrise over the quiet lake while Ethan spoke about bringing future children there someday. Why would he place such treasured property at risk without ever telling her? She turned another page and discovered records of anonymous monthly payments sent to a long-term medical care foundation. The recipient's identity had been partially hidden for privacy reasons, but one familiar surname immediately caught her attention: Anderson. Emily's fingers froze. Anderson had been her maiden name before marrying Ethan. She quickly searched through the remaining paperwork until another folded letter slipped onto the floor. As she picked it up, an old photograph slid out beside it. The picture had clearly been taken years before she ever met Ethan. It showed her late father standing beside a much younger Ethan outside a small construction office. Both men were smiling warmly while shaking hands. Emily stared at the photograph in complete disbelief. Her father had passed away months before she and Ethan first met at a charity fundraiser. She had always believed they had been strangers until that evening. Yet here they stood together years earlier, looking like trusted friends. Her pulse quickened. How had Ethan known her father? Why had neither man ever told her? She unfolded the second letter with trembling hands. Across the top, in her father's familiar handwriting, appeared a single sentence that made every certainty in her world begin to crumble. Ethan, if anything ever happens to me, promise me you will look after my daughter, even if she never learns why. Emily lowered herself into a chair, unable to take her eyes off the faded photograph resting on the kitchen table. The image looked ordinary, yet it had quietly rewritten an entire chapter of her life. Her father had never mentioned Ethan Brooks. Not once. During the final months of his illness, they had spoken about family, unfinished dreams, and the importance of choosing kindness even when life felt unfair. But Ethan's name had never crossed his lips. Emily carefully unfolded the second page attached to her father's letter. This time it was dated nearly 6 months before his passing. Ethan, I know you will try to argue with me because that is who you are. You believe every person should carry only his own burdens. But I have watched the way you care for people when nobody is looking. If I cannot be here for Emily one day, I trust you more than I trust anyone else. Promise me only one thing. Never let her feel like she owes you anything. Emily blinked away the tears gathering in her eyes. That sentence sounded exactly like her father. He had always believed genuine generosity expected nothing in return. She looked back at Ethan's handwritten letter. Suddenly every line carried a different meaning. He had not been hiding money. He had been hiding a promise. Her thoughts drifted backward to the first evening she had met Ethan at a charity fundraiser 5 years earlier. He had seemed almost strangely familiar, as though he already understood the stories she shared about her father. At the time she assumed he was simply compassionate. Now she wondered if every thoughtful question had come from someone who had already known the man she loved and admired most. Emily stood and walked toward Ethan's home office for the first time in months. The room remained exactly as he had left it that morning. His desk was perfectly organized. Family photographs occupied one corner beside a simple fountain pen and a leather notebook. She hesitated before opening the top drawer. Inside were neatly labeled folders rather than hidden secrets. One folder immediately caught her attention. Anderson Foundation. She slowly opened it. Dozens of receipts documented anonymous donations made over several years to scholarships established in her father's memory. Ethan had never placed his own name on a single contribution. Another folder contained correspondence with hospitals, financial advisors, and attorneys. Every decision followed the same pattern. Protect Emily. Preserve her father's legacy. Keep everything confidential. Emily sank into Ethan's office chair as another memory surfaced. 2 years earlier, she had accused him of caring more about business than family after he canceled a weekend trip at the last minute. Ethan had quietly apologized without offering any explanation. Later that evening, she remembered seeing him return home exhausted after midnight carrying a briefcase filled with paperwork. She had assumed he had spent another night negotiating corporate deals. Now one receipt in front of her revealed he had actually spent those hours finalizing legal documents that secured funding for the Anderson Memorial Scholarship Program. The date matched perfectly. Emily covered her face with both hands. Every painful memory she replayed during the past year suddenly seemed incomplete. Not because her loneliness had been imaginary, but because she had never known what Ethan had been sacrificing during those silent absences. She reached for the leather notebook resting beside the family photographs. Most pages contained ordinary reminders and meeting notes, but one page had been folded neatly in half. Across the top, Ethan had written only one sentence. If the day ever comes when Emily chooses freedom instead of me, I will respect her decision because love cannot survive inside a prison built from secrets, even when those secrets were meant to protect her. Emily closed the notebook slowly, realizing she no longer knew whether the greatest mistake in their marriage had been Ethan's silence or her willingness to believe that silence meant he had stopped loving her. Emily remained in Ethan's office until the first lights of evening reflected across the windows overlooking the city. The room no longer felt like the place where her husband had hidden himself from their marriage. Instead, it felt like the place where he had quietly carried burdens he believed no one else should share. Every folder she opened revealed another decision made for someone else's benefit. None of them improved his reputation. None of them made his life easier. They all pointed toward the same painful truth. Ethan had sacrificed his own peace to keep a promise that had never belonged to him in the first place. She reached for one final folder tucked beneath the others. Unlike the rest, it contained no financial documents. Only a sealed envelope marked with today's date and a simple note written in Ethan's handwriting. Open only after the divorce is final. Emily's hands trembled as she carefully unfolded the letter inside. Emily, if this reaches you, then I have already accepted that I failed in the one promise I wanted most to keep. Not the promise I made to your father, but the promise I made to you on our wedding day. I wanted to protect your happiness without asking you to carry my burdens. Somewhere along the way, I confused protecting you with shutting you out. For that, I am deeply sorry. She continued reading through blurred eyes. When your father became ill, he asked me to promise that your future would never be limited by financial hardship or unfinished responsibilities. He knew I loved you long before I found the courage to tell you. He also knew you would never accept help if you believed it came from obligation. That is why everything had to remain hidden. After we married, new challenges appeared. My company entered a difficult period that threatened thousands of employees and every charitable program your father had started. I could have saved my public image by abandoning those commitments, but I could not abandon my word. Every late night, every canceled trip, every meeting you believed was another business obligation was actually another attempt to protect the people depending on those promises. Emily pressed the paper against her chest as memories flooded back with unbearable clarity. She remembered complaining that Ethan had missed her birthday dinner because of an emergency board meeting. She now found a schedule attached to the letter showing that same evening had been spent negotiating funding to prevent the closure of the Anderson Community Education Center established in her father's memory. Another attachment documented the sale of Ethan's personal investment portfolio. The proceeds had quietly covered scholarship deficits during an economic downturn. There was no publicity, no interviews, no recognition. Ethan had simply signed the papers and returned to work as though nothing extraordinary had happened. The final page carried only a few handwritten lines. If choosing between your happiness and my reputation was ever necessary, I would choose your happiness every single time. I accepted that one day you might believe I had stopped loving you because explaining everything would have broken the promise your father trusted me to keep. I only hope that someday you will understand that silence is not always the absence of love. Sometimes it is the price someone believes they must pay to protect it. Emily quietly folded the letter and looked around the office one more time. The man she believed had chosen ambition over family had actually been choosing responsibility over recognition every single day. For the first time since leaving the courthouse that morning, she no longer wondered whether filing for divorce had been the right decision. She wondered whether she had ever truly known the extraordinary man she had married. Emily looked at the clock on the office wall. It was almost 9 in the evening. Ethan should have been home hours ago, yet the condominium remained silent except for the faint hum of the refrigerator. For months she had resented those empty evenings. Tonight they felt completely different. Instead of assuming he had chosen another business meeting over their marriage, she found herself wondering what unseen responsibility had delayed him this time. She carefully gathered every letter, photograph, and document exactly as she had found them. The only difference was Ethan's final letter, which she quietly slipped into her handbag. She needed answers that no document could fully provide. Almost on instinct, she reached for her phone and opened Ethan's contact. Her thumb hovered above his name. She had imagined this conversation hundreds of times during the past year, but in every version she was angry. Now she felt something far more difficult: regret. Before she could press the call button, headlights appeared through the living room window. Ethan's black sedan pulled into the underground garage entrance beneath their building. Emily's heart began beating faster. A few moments later, she heard the familiar sound of the front door unlocking. Ethan stepped inside carrying his leather briefcase, looking even more exhausted than he had that morning. His tie had been loosened, his sleeves rolled neatly above his wrists, and the quiet smile he always wore appeared only for a brief second before he noticed Emily standing in the hallway. Neither of them spoke immediately. The silence felt completely different now. It was no longer filled with distance. It was filled with everything that had never been said. Ethan carefully placed his briefcase beside the door. "I did not expect you to still be here," he said gently. Emily searched his face for signs of deception but found only honest surprise. "I almost left," she admitted softly. "But I found something that belonged to you." Ethan's eyes lowered to the familiar envelope resting in her hands. The color slowly drained from his face. He understood instantly. For the first time since she had known him, Emily saw genuine fear replace his calm expression. Not fear for himself, but fear that she had discovered the one truth he had tried hardest to keep hidden. He closed his eyes briefly before taking a slow breath. "You opened it," he said quietly. Emily nodded. "I did." Another long silence settled between them. Ethan did not ask for the documents back. He did not try to explain them away or invent excuses. Instead, he walked toward the kitchen, poured 2 glasses of water, and placed one in front of her exactly as he had done countless evenings before difficult conversations neither of them ever finished. "Then you know about your father," he said at last. Emily looked into his tired blue eyes. "I know enough to realize I knew almost nothing." Ethan lowered himself into the chair across from her. The exhaustion on his face seemed older than the past few years. "I wanted to tell you so many times," he admitted. "Every anniversary, every birthday, every night you asked me what was wrong. I came close more times than you will ever know." Emily tightened her fingers around the glass. "Why did you not?" Ethan looked toward the wedding photograph above the fireplace before answering. "Because your father trusted me with his final promise. He believed that if you ever learned the truth too early, you would spend your life trying to repay a debt that never existed. He wanted you to love freely, never because you felt obligated. I chose to keep that promise, but I never imagined the silence would slowly convince you that I had stopped loving you. That is the mistake I will regret for the rest of my life." Emily felt tears quietly gathering again as she realized that the greatest obstacle between them had never been a lack of love. It had been 2 people trying to protect each other while quietly breaking their own hearts. Emily slowly reached across the kitchen table and placed her hand over Ethan's. It was the first time they had touched without hesitation in months. Neither of them tried to speak immediately because words suddenly felt far too small for everything that had remained hidden between them. The quiet room carried a different kind of silence now, one that no longer separated them but invited honesty. Ethan looked down at their hands before letting out a slow breath. "I should have trusted you with the truth," he said softly. "I kept telling myself I was protecting you, but every day I stayed silent. I was asking you to carry confusion instead." Emily gently shook her head. And I should have trusted the man I married instead of believing the worst every time you walked through that door late at night. She smiled sadly. We both thought we were protecting the other person. Ethan gave a faint smile for the first time that evening. It seems we were equally unsuccessful. A quiet laugh escaped Emily before tears quickly followed. Ethan instinctively moved closer, then paused, uncertain whether she still welcomed that comfort. Emily answered the unspoken question by wrapping her arms around him. They remained there for a long moment, saying nothing while months of loneliness slowly dissolved into relief. Eventually, Emily stepped back and looked directly into his eyes. There is still something I do not understand. Ethan nodded. Ask me anything. She picked up the folder containing the financial records. The company, these donations, the scholarships, the trust. You carried all of this alone. Why did it have to be only you? Ethan leaned back in his chair. Because 2 years ago the company faced the worst financial crisis in its history. Several board members wanted to eliminate every charitable commitment your father helped establish. They believed those programs were unnecessary expenses. If I refused, they were prepared to remove me as chief executive officer. Emily listened carefully. So every late meeting was another negotiation, Ethan answered quietly. Every canceled dinner was another attempt to protect hundreds of employees, dozens of scholarships, and every family depending on those community programs. I believed if I could save everything first, then I would finally have time to repair our marriage afterward. He lowered his eyes. I was wrong. There is always another meeting, another problem, another crisis. I kept postponing us until I almost lost the most important person in my life. Emily reached for another document. And now, Ethan looked toward the city lights beyond the window. Tomorrow morning the board will vote again. This time they want to dissolve the Anderson Foundation completely and redirect its funding into short-term corporate profits. I have been fighting that proposal for 6 months. Emily stared at him in disbelief. You were still protecting my father's legacy even after I filed for divorce. Ethan answered without hesitation. A promise does not stop being a promise because life becomes difficult. Emily stood and walked toward the living room window. She remembered every child her father had encouraged to dream beyond their circumstances. She remembered scholarship ceremonies, community centers, and families whose lives had quietly changed because someone chose compassion over convenience. Turning back toward Ethan, she realized this battle had never been about money. It had always been about preserving hope. She took a deep breath before speaking with calm certainty. Tomorrow you are not walking into that boardroom alone. Ethan looked genuinely surprised. Emily. She interrupted him with a gentle smile. I filed for divorce because I believed my husband had stopped fighting for us. Now I know he never stopped fighting. He was simply fighting battles I could not see. If there is still time to save everything my father believed in and everything we almost lost together, then we face it side by side. No more secrets. No more silence. Whatever happens tomorrow, we will meet it as husband and wife. The following morning dawned clear over Chicago, the first rays of sunlight reflecting from the glass towers that surrounded Brooks' global headquarters. Emily stood beside Ethan in the executive elevator, not as a guest and not as a stranger, but as the woman who finally understood the quiet strength of the man beside her. Neither of them spoke much during the ride to the top floor. They no longer needed rehearsed speeches. Honesty had already replaced the silence that once divided them. As the elevator doors opened, members of the board were already gathering around the long walnut conference table. Some greeted Ethan respectfully, while others exchanged cautious glances after noticing Emily walking beside him. She could almost feel the uncertainty in the room. Rumors of their divorce had quietly circulated throughout the company for weeks, yet no one expected to see them arrive together. Ethan calmly took his seat at the head of the table while Emily accepted a chair along the side reserved for invited observers. The meeting began with financial reports, quarterly projections, and routine presentations before finally reaching the final agenda item. One senior board member cleared his throat before speaking. The recommendation remains unchanged. The Anderson Foundation should be dissolved. Its assets can strengthen shareholder returns and improve short-term market confidence. Several members nodded in agreement. Ethan listened without interruption until every opinion had been expressed. Only then did he stand. He did not raise his voice. He did not criticize anyone around the table. Instead, he quietly placed several folders in front of every board member. "Before any vote is taken," he said calmly, "there is information each of you deserves to review." Curious expressions spread around the room as documents were opened. Inside were independent financial audits, long-term economic studies, and community impact reports prepared over the previous 2 years. Every page demonstrated that the foundation had not weakened the company. It had strengthened employee retention, improved public trust, increased recruitment, and generated partnerships worth far more than its operating costs. Several directors exchanged surprised looks while continuing to read. Ethan remained standing. "Many people believe compassion and responsible business cannot exist together," he continued. "These reports prove otherwise." Emily then quietly stood. Every eye turned toward her. She held the photograph of her late father standing beside a much younger Ethan. "Most of you never knew why this foundation existed," she said gently. "Neither did I until yesterday. My father believed success should always create opportunities for others." Ethan protected that vision even when it damaged his own reputation, even when it nearly cost him his marriage, and even when no one would ever know what he sacrificed. The conference room fell completely silent. She then placed Ethan's handwritten letter beside the photograph. He never asked for recognition. He only wanted to keep a promise. No dramatic arguments followed. No accusations filled the room. Instead, the evidence quietly spoke for itself. One by one, board members finished reading the reports. Several who had previously supported eliminating the foundation slowly closed their folders and looked toward Ethan with new respect. The chairman finally requested a formal vote. This time every hand except one rose in favor of preserving the Anderson Foundation and expanding its educational programs across additional communities. The motion passed by an overwhelming majority. As the meeting concluded, directors approached Ethan not with applause, but with sincere handshakes and quiet words of appreciation. Emily watched from across the room as the weight Ethan had carried for years finally seemed lighter. When he turned toward her, their eyes met with a simple understanding. They had not won because someone had been defeated. They had won because truth had finally been allowed to stand where silence once lived. 6 months later, the first warm Saturday of spring filled the Chicago Botanical Garden with gentle sunlight and the quiet sound of birds greeting the morning. Emily smiled as she adjusted a simple white bouquet, resting on a wooden table surrounded by close family, longtime friends, scholarship recipients, and several employees whose lives had been touched by the Anderson Foundation. There was no extravagant ballroom, no orchestra, and no display of wealth. Ethan had insisted that if they were going to celebrate a new beginning, it should reflect everything they had learned together. The ceremony was intentionally small because this day was never about proving anything to the world. It was about honoring the promises they now understood completely. The same officiant who had quietly prepared their divorce paperwork months earlier now stood beneath a flowering tree, smiling as Ethan and Emily walked toward one another. Life had a remarkable way of rewriting endings when people found the courage to face the truth. Ethan looked healthier than he had in years. The constant exhaustion had disappeared from his eyes, replaced by a quiet confidence Emily had not seen since the earliest days of their marriage. His work schedule had changed as well. He no longer believed every burden belonged on his shoulders alone. Weekly leadership meetings now ended on time. Vacations were scheduled months in advance and protected as carefully as any corporate commitment. Emily had also changed. Instead of wondering what Ethan was hiding, she had become an active partner in preserving her father's legacy. Together they expanded the Anderson Foundation into several neighboring states, creating scholarships, mentorship programs, and community learning centers that reflected the values both her father and Ethan believed should never disappear. Their marriage had become stronger not because life suddenly became easier, but because they had finally chosen openness instead of silence. When the officiant invited them to speak, Ethan looked at Emily with a warm smile. "The first promise I made to you was to love you," he said softly. "The second promise I made was to protect you. I finally understand that protecting someone never means shutting them out. From this day forward, every challenge, every decision, every victory, and every fear belongs to both of us." Emily gently squeezed his hands before answering. "I once believed love disappeared when words became quiet. Now I know that love also needs honesty to survive. I promise that I will never again replace questions with assumptions or silence with fear. Whatever tomorrow brings, we will face it together." As they exchanged rings once more, warm applause filled the garden. Among the guests sat several young scholarship recipients whose education had been made possible through the foundation Ethan had fought so hard to protect. One little girl quietly handed Emily a drawing of two people standing beneath a large tree with dozens of children smiling around them. Across the top she had written in careful handwriting, "Thank you for giving families hope." Emily felt tears of gratitude as she showed the drawing to Ethan. He smiled and carefully folded it into the inside pocket of his jacket beside the old letter from her father, where it would remain as another reminder that kindness always leaves a legacy greater than wealth. Later that afternoon, after the guests had gone home, Ethan and Emily returned to their condominium overlooking the city. Hanging inside their home office, framed beneath simple glass, were the divorce papers that had almost ended their marriage. Visitors occasionally asked why they kept such a painful memory on the wall. Ethan would simply smile before Emily answered with quiet certainty. "Because those papers remind us that assumptions can destroy what truth is still trying to protect. We nearly lost everything because we stopped talking. We found everything again the moment we finally chose honesty." As the evening sun settled beyond the Chicago skyline, Ethan wrapped his arm gently around Emily's shoulders while they watched the lights appear across the city they called home. Their greatest treasure had never been the company, the fortune, or the success others admired. It was the simple decision to trust each other completely. Sometimes the strongest marriages are not the ones that never face hardship. They are the ones that find the courage to rebuild, one honest conversation at a time.